I remember some years ago in a Catholic magazine I read an article about a priest, by a priest, who was talking about a homily he was giving, presumably on this gospel. He went in a wealthy suburban parish, the kind where they commute in and spend all their day in highfalutin financial institutions. So he was quoting that famous last line, "You cannot serve both God and Mammon." And he imagined this silent wave coming back at him. I hope this was inaccurate on his part, but this silent wave that came back and said, "Oh, yes, we can." Can we serve money? Mammon is an Aramaic word which means wealth. So you cannot serve both God and wealth. Now, money, like everything else created, is okay in itself, and it can be used for good things, but too often it's misused. And Jesus, who was a great prophet, that was how he was known in his own time, the great prophet. And remember, a prophet is not someone who predicts the future. A prophet is someone who speaks the truth to power, or who speaks God's perspective and God's words in the world. So that's what Jesus was doing here and so many times. And so like all prophets who are full of divine fervor and the urgency of the message they have to communicate for the sake of the people, they use intemperate language. They use exaggeration and hyperbole. Well, we saw a few weeks ago how Jesus said, unless you hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and your wife and your children and your own property and your own life, you cannot be my disciple. Or elsewhere where he says, if your eye or your hand cause you to sin, well, pluck it out, chop it off. It's the urgency of getting the message and acting on it. Or what he says also elsewhere about money. He says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow. And it astonished the disciples, and it still astonishes us today. Can you imagine if you posted that line in a corporate boardroom or on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange? Easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And here, similarly, he calls money, wealth, the mammon of iniquity, of unrighteousness, unjust mammon, because that's how it so often turns out. These are very powerful phrases on Jesus' part. I often think that Christians who focus so much on the culture wars are really just trying to evade and avoid the terrifyingly challenging things that Jesus actually does talk about, like the danger of money and care for the poor, seeing him in the poor, about not judging, about nonviolence, and loving your enemies. When have we ever concentrated on that? A lot easier to talk about something that, well, let's face it, usually asks a whole lot of somebody else, not us. So we really need to face what Jesus is saying to us. But what is he saying to us? This parable is, as most have recognized, one of the most very difficult to preach on, because he seems to be saying, look, the master commended, praised a dishonest steward for acting prudently. Prudently is not a very good translation. It sounds like a virtue. It's more like shrewdly, intelligently, craftily. But it seems almost to be saying, well, so he's praising dishonesty? Well, some people have taken a more positive approach to the parable, and they point out some of the financial customs of the times that the gospel was written, and the master would most likely have charged something like 100% interest on his loan. So when the steward calls in those who are the debtors, he's basically saying, cut out the interest, You owe 100 barrels of oil, pay 50. In other words, he's sticking it to the man, as that famous song in School of Rock says. In other words, he's trying to restore justice to the world, and these exorbitant interests that are charged can be put away. Or another way of saying it, as some have, in God's kingdom, the masters and the masters of the universe who control everything don't get their way, don't get their revenge. The whole turns things upside down. Nonetheless, it's clear that the early church wrestled with this parable as it stands, because the whole rest of the gospel we have today after the parable are a series of attempts, scholars think, of the church either to take other sayings of Jesus or to interject their own reflections on the parable to make various senses of it. So let's look at a couple of these. So we praise the dishonest steward for his shrewdness, because, the next phrase says, the children of this world are much shrewder in their dealings with their own kind than are the children of light. In other words, the message is, look at all intensity and energy and concentration and dedication that all these people put into their worldly lives. Why don't we show at least as much fervor and dedication and enthusiasm and engagement in working for the kingdom of God, which is so much more important. That's the first lesson that they're drawing from this. Why aren't we as creative? Not for our own sake, but for the sake of the kingdom of God. So that's already a very good reflection we can ask ourselves. How engaged are we with what really matters? Yes, of course, we have to worry about our job and our bank account, caring for those we love, leading a dignified life, being able to give to charity. But where is our heart? Where is our primary focus? What's our priority? That's where our focus is. As Jesus says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be. So where is your heart? Where is your treasure? What are you most concerned about, practically speaking, in the use of your energies every day? Then he goes on to say, another line, make friends for yourselves with the unjust, with money in this world, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal habitations. Okay, that seems to echo what the steward himself said to himself earlier. Oh, I know what I'll do, so that when I'm thrown out of the job, when I'm fired, they'll receive me into their homes. Make friends for yourselves, which is what the steward did. What about the eternal habitations? It seems to be saying, make friends for yourselves with the unjust mammon by using it well in this world for the kingdom of God, for giving alms, for good purposes, so that when it fails, you may enter the kingdom of God after death, the eternal habitations. Or another version, the Latin Vulgate version, has, so that when you fail, when you die, they may receive you into the eternal habitations. Okay, so in other words, use it well. Use it for good purposes. The next line, it says, if you can be trusted with a little, you can be trusted with much. If you're dishonest in a little, you're dishonest in much. So if you're dishonest in small things like money, think how much more dishonest or else you'll be in greater things as well. So probably how you treat money is how you treat everything, and vice versa. It says if you can't be trusted with unjust wealth, who will give you the true wealth? If you can't be trusted with what is someone else's, who will give you what is your own? If you can't be trusted with ordinary money, who will give you the true treasure of the kingdom of God? If you can't be trusted with someone else's, which all wealth comes from God and belongs to God, you're just a steward. Someone else's wealth, you're just stewards. We're just stewards, like the steward in the gospel. Hopefully not like the steward in the gospel. Who will give you what is yours? And our true inheritance, as St. Paul uses that word, our true inheritance and the pledge of our inheritance is the Spirit of God, the life of God, the kingdom of God within us. That's what we were made for. That's what belongs to us. The rest is just minor stuff which is entrusted to us for a time to use well. So all those are interesting interpretations. And then, of course, the final line that I already quoted. You can't serve two masters. Where is your heart? Where is your treasure? In other words. And one reason you can't serve money too dedicatedly or too exclusively is that, let's face it, if you really get rich, probably, not necessarily, but probably somewhere along the way you're going to exploit and trample and cheat and misuse and abuse. Lots of examples of that. That is what the first reading is about from the prophet Amos. He was someone who stood up to power. He was only a shepherd, but God sent him to the kings and the priests in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 9th century BC to tell them how things are. And of course he got into trouble with both of them. Power hates the truth. And what he was saying is what we heard today. You're trampling on the poor. You're saying, well, when will the Sabbath be passed? And when can we go out and fix our scales so that they cheat? And when can we sell what's worthless? So, in other words, cheating and trampling on the poor. In fact, there's even a play on the word Sabbath in the reading. The word Sabbath means rest, desist, resting on the Sabbath. But as a verb, it means make to cease. So you make the poor to cease. You destroy the poor by your kind of Sabbath. So Amos rails against the false, cheap piety of people who go to church and go to the temple and make pretense of long prayers, to use Jesus' phrase, while they're trampling on the poor in their daily lives. That's the kind of thing that happens. And that's, well, to use the phrase in the next part of the chapter 16, Luke is called the gospel, the evangelist of the poor. And the very next phrase, if you keep reading the chapter, is the Pharisees were upset by what Jesus was saying. They were lovers of money. Jesus said, what human beings esteem is an abomination to God. Well, that's another prophetic statement. Wow. What human beings esteem is an abomination to God. And by the way, to speak of the culture wars, isn't that a phrase that's thrown around a lot by Christians nowadays? Oh, the abomination of this or that. Don't forget, the only time Jesus ever uses that very strong word is in relation to money. It's an abomination the way people are using money and cheating and trampling on the poor. Feathering their own nests and not caring for their own brothers and sisters. That is the abomination that we have to look at. And of course, we'd rather not. And then it follows with the famous parable of Lazarus and who's begging crumbs from the table of the rich man, remember? That powerful parable. So we really have to take a good look at ourselves and our own society, where income equality is becoming unimaginable compared to previous decades. Where on the one hand, a rich man can pay $50 million for a painting to hang on the wall of his yacht, and someone else can't even afford subway fare. Something is wrong. And it's partly our responsibility. It is our responsibility for our own brothers and sisters, our own flesh, as Isaiah calls it. So we need to do what the second reading is asking us. Pray, open our hearts and our minds to be as Christ, the mediator, who, to use another, he uses another financial term. He says, Christ became a ransom for many, so we might have life. Pouring himself out, giving of himself, as that wonderful verse we used from Corinthians in the Gospel acclamation. Christ, who was rich, he became poor for our sakes, so that by his poverty we might become rich. Meditate on that for a couple of weeks. And at the end he says, I want the men, and he means males, I want the men to raise their hands in prayer, because it's usually the men, the males, not always, but most of the time, who are in the financial sector, and pray. So every morning, as we dedicate our energies and get ready, we should start with this before we get to this. We really have to ask ourselves, what are our priorities? Where is our heart? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be.